The new chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, Sara Bronin, is with us, and we are very excited that she was finally confirmed and able to join us for this conference. And joining her are Reid Nelson, the Executive Director of the ACHP. Once again, we have Jaime Loichinger, who's the Assistant Director at the ACHP, Ira Matt, Director of the Office of Native American Affairs, and Jamie Lee Marks, Senior Analyst in the Office of Native American Affairs. And I want to give them all a round of applause and welcome them to the stage. And just like the other panels, y'all are on your own for moderating yourselves, but it looks like you have a presentation here. It's not up on the screen yet, but it's on the laptop. Are you guys doing something? It's just what now?
That's just what Ona does our updates.
Oh, okay. Yeah, for your guys' updates. Well, when you're ready, there's a clicker up here.
There you go.
And I'm gonna go eat some cupcakes.
Put this down a little bit. All right. So thank you, Shasta, for that introduction. I'm Sara Bronin. I'm very happy to be here today. I want to just give thanks to all of you who are here today. It's a wonderful convening, and a special thanks to the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians for hosting us and welcoming us to this really beautiful part of the country. So I'm coming to you at the start of my third week. It's my 2 weeks plus 1 day as chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. So, oh, thank you. Can I get this every week? A little round of applause. So as you all know, this is the federal agency that it is tasked with advising the White House and Congress on historic preservation policy and administering the Section 106 review process that you all participate in and are all very familiar with. It was suggested that, given your familiarity with the ACHP, I'd not focus on ACHP, but maybe talk a little bit about my background and what I would like to do potentially as chair of this agency. So just a little bit about my background. I'm a 7th generation Texan, Mexican American. I'm an attorney, an architect, and a scholar. I come to you on a public service leave from my permanent position at Cornell University, which is always careful to recognize that it's located on the traditional homelands of the Gayukono Nation, though it has never officially acknowledged its complicity with land dispossession, nor offered restitution to the Native communities affected by the action of those who founded Cornell. At this university, I'm on the faculties of the Planning Department, Law School, Architecture Department, and Real Estate faculties, and I'm a fellow of the Atkinson Center on Sustainability and an affiliate of the Cornell Center of Social Sciences. And I rattle off all of these affiliations just to emphasize one thing, which is that when it comes to the problem that we are all sharing and trying to figure out solutions for, which is how we deal with the built environment, how we deal with cultural resources, with historic properties, with the natural environment, we really all have to take an interdisciplinary approach. And that is something that I hope to bring to this position. Being here at NATHPO and connecting with you this week is it's just so fortuitous that I was able to make it in under the wire in the confirmation process and make this meeting. It's a really important priority to me to be consulting with you and engaging you as fellow nations, government to government relationships. I see that we have a great staff at ACHP that takes that relationship very seriously, and I hope to continue to carry that forward. I'm not a member of a tribal nation myself. One of the very first times that I heard directly from tribal leaders was actually, I think, back in 2010, when in DC, there was a conference put on by the National NAGPRA program called NAGPRA at 20. And I don't know if anybody was at that conference. Maybe not. But that meeting, that conversation, I think it was a couple days, and I attended every session I could, really affected me a lot. And again, the first time really as still a law professor back then, hearing directly from tribal nations. What I learned was, of course, as we all know, NAGPRO is not necessarily fulfilling its purpose, and there's far to go, still far to go. And I, as a professor, didn't really have a chance to incorporate sort of all of what I learned, except through a couple of books that I wrote on historic preservation law, which have chapters on tribal resources and include statements by a coalition of Oklahoma and Southern Indian tribes about NAGPRA and a few other places where I felt like I could at least pull in some of that tribal voice. So again, this is an opportunity for me to really re-engage with that, and engage you all. So it's great to be here. Just a couple of things I want to talk about next, focusing back on ACHP. So last week, I was fortunate to engage with some of you in the government to government required consultation on our proposed policy statement on burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects. The development of this policy was undertaken, of course, before my time as chair, led by our current staff. A few of the members that you see here today, again, you're very familiar with everybody on the panel, I think, but they've carried this forward. And I think it's an incredibly important priority for the agency. It's important for us not just to adopt the policy and sort of let it sit there, but it is important for us to take it to other federal agencies, to other state, nonprofit, local agencies who can learn something from the embedded knowledge that we hope to enshrine in the eventual voted on official statement. So thanks to the staff for getting that done, and for hopefully if we adopt it at our next meeting, which is just in 2 weeks, we'll be able to then take that and bring it to as many people as we can, as really, in my opinion, pretty basic statements about the way that we should treat all of these, all of the resources, human remains, and objects that are included in that policy. It shouldn't need to be in a policy, but it is, and we will promote it. Policy statements like that policy really represent the collective position of the advisory council. So in addition to myself, there are 23 other members of the advisory council. Some are appointed by the president, some represent federal agencies. And when the ACHP votes on a policy, it needs to ensure, as we will with this one, that it will result in positive change. And thank you again for your input. I was really struck by, in the conversation last Friday, I know a couple of you who participated in that are here today, about the thoughtfulness of the comments, and the deep engagement and the seriousness with which you take your ability to consult. And so again, just really appreciate that. Also last week, I had the opportunity to participate in the White House Council's Cultural Resources and Sacred Sites and Climate Change Planning and Response webinar, very long title, alongside with Mike Durglow Jr. of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and Shasta as a representative of the Paula Band of Mission Indians. Together in that webinar, I think our speakers and a couple others that also spoke help to educate federal staff and others about the need to account for tribal values and tribal resources as part of their climate change efforts. But our work is not really done with just a webinar. And to that end, we've also been working on a policy on climate change, which will go out for tribal engagement very soon, and for which we hope to receive your feedback. And again, a lot of this is, our policy statements tend to be things that maybe are common sense to those of us in this room, but it's important for us to refine those, to get them in writing, to adopt them, and then to carry them forward. If we don't reduce something to writing, and maybe this is the law professor speaking, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen, or it's not in writing, it's not official. So let's keep making things official and moving forward. From the climate perspective, I'm super interested in climate issues. That's one of the things that I write about a lot. I worked on the city of Hartford's climate action plan. It's a city that never had one before. It's one of the poorest cities in the country, 85% Black and Latino. on the research side, I've written about how the federal standards need to be expanded or changed to account for the climate change and express some skepticism at some of the things, other things that we do. My opinions are not necessarily ACHP opinions, but you might find some of those reflected in the new climate change policy draft, which again, I encourage you to get involved with. So beyond climate change, beyond the burial grounds policy, there's a few other issues that I would like to note for your, just in our later discussion, we can talk about it in Q&A, that I am interested in pursuing, and I know you've been discussing for some time. So one of them is supporting the integration of our guidance on Indigenous knowledge, our understanding, again, from you into the Section 106 process, as well as was discussed this morning, TCPs, and figuring out how we can incorporate, enshrine into words, formal policy, guidance, even regulations. I'm not scared of that either, to include as much as we can to make it official. I also am prioritizing working with the National Park Service Director, Chuck Sams, and Secretary Holland, because the Interior Department is the most important department in terms of, along with ACHP, really having a lot of say over how all of these issues play out. So it's certainly that relationship, I think, is going to be extremely important to me. I guess in general, one of the things that I took away from this morning is that I hope you see me as an ally. I hope you see me as somebody who can help to advance some of these long stagnant issues that NATHPO has been talking about and that you've been talking about as individual nations. But it struck me this morning when we're talking about these timelines of years and years and years and years going into the future, that I feel like I'm already out of time. So I guess I say that to say, I'm just a political appointee. I can only do so much. I'm only here for a short amount of time. Lots of things take a really long time. I just want to say that I took this role not to sit around and have a job. I took this role because I want to help make some positive changes. I really, I have nothing to lose in this job. I'm on leave from a position I can go back to. Nothing I say, nothing I do. I'm here in a position that staff is not, where I can go out and advocate for some of the things that the council says. So, well, I think oftentimes in federal government, you see a very conservative approach, an incremental approach, and I will embrace that to the extent I'm legally required to do. I want to just tell you now that I really, really, truly intend to work with the leaders of NATHPO to get some of these things as much as we can over the finish line, given my very short window in this position. So with that, I rely on you to help us or help me understand what the issues are. I don't come into this position with any inborn or ingrained knowledge about how things should go or what things should happen. I don't have the same constraints as staff. My biggest constraint is time. So the sooner you can get me sort of how we can go about moving things forward, the sooner I can help to support the staff in their efforts to do so, the better. So tell me what we can do, tell me what we can do now, and then hold me accountable for my pledge today. So thank you very much. And I was supposed to say with that, I'm introducing our amazing interim executive director, Reid Nelson.
Thank you, Chair Bronin. I appreciate that. And it's really an honor to see you all again, to see you all in person. I've seen you via Zoom like so many of us have for the last several years, but it's really great to see you in person. Again, I'm Reid Nelson. I am the acting executive director at the ACHP. I am also sort of wearing two hats, the director of the Office of Federal Agency Programs, which is the office that most directly oversees the Section 106 review process on behalf of the ACHP. and works with you and states and others in implementing that process. It's really nice to be here in the presence of so many people that are familiar to me, that I've known for so many years. I have been coming to NATHPO conferences since the very first NATHPO conferences. In fact, I worked for the Navajo Nation in its Historic Preservation Department in the mid-1990s when it became one of the first 6 TIPOs. I worked for the Navajo people for 18 years. And so when I'm here addressing this group, I sort of feel like I'm at home a little bit. So it's nice to see you. I wanted to just also very deliberately and very clearly thank you for all the hard work you do in historic preservation and in implementing the Section 106 review process. I know that's not easy. We have a staff of about 22 people on the advisory council staff that work day in and day out to help implement the Section 106 review process. And I know in working with them that it's a challenge, and I know for you it's a challenge as well. I know you get the same question over and over. You interpret the regulations, you explain the regulations, you try to convince, you try to cajole, you try to negotiate. You use everything you can to help someone understand the broad goals of the National Historic Preservation Act. And I know it takes a lot of work. So thank you so much for that. You really are the front lines of the Section 106 review process, and we very much appreciate your work. I also want to just acknowledge that you're not alone. We have a staff of about 42 people at the ACHP. About 2/3 of them on it at any one point are probably working on something Section 106 related. Ira and staff are working on a lot of other issues important to you on sort of a policy and program level. But I want you to understand that we're available to you. I have a policy that staff must respond to and reply to emails and calls within 24 hours, and we mean it. We try to be responsive. I will tell you, my experience is not every federal agency is responsive. I hope your experience with us is that we are. Now, that doesn't mean we can always give you the answer that you want or need, but we will always give you our best advice. So please, by all means, contact us in any of the offices, IRA, the Office of Federal Agency Programs, other staff here, and we'll do our level best to help you, because I think as we heard earlier, none of us can do this alone, right? It really takes all of us collaborating together. I want to just give a few brief updates and then mostly get out of the way, because you're going to hear, I think, more substantive things from the other folks here that I'll introduce briefly when I'm done. But I did want to just talk about a couple things that I think are hopefully of interest and important to this audience. One is I'm really excited to let you all know that we are about to hire a digital operations coordinator, kind of a funny title, and admittedly the acronym is DOC, and I wish it wasn't a DOC, but we're about to hire a digital operations coordinator. And one of the really important things that staff person will be doing at the ACHP is looking at how we can work with states and tribes and preservation organizations and federal agencies and really improve the quality and the availability of digital information about the historic preservation review process. Now, we also recognize that it's really important to protect that information and make sure the right people are managing it. Tribes, from our perspective, manage their own data, and well, it should be. So I want to be clear that my interest isn't necessarily in exposing, or sort of requiring the availability of that information, as much as it is to make sure that you have the best advice from us and some examples and knowledge and perhaps wisdom from us on how to manage information and use it in the Section 106 review process. So you should be hearing in the next couple of months, as we bring that person on board, a little bit more about what we're doing in that regard. But I think working with tribes is certainly a really important part of that person's portfolio. Sort of on a semi-related note, I wanted to just add a few more notes about a conversation I think I came in and heard the tail end of. I think Shasta was doing some math about 5 million divided by 574. That's the funding set aside by the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council to assist tribes in participating in Section 106 reviews on infrastructure projects. And I just want to note that while that is the permitting council that's advancing that, I'm proud to say that we were in a dialogue with the permitting council for a very long time, for the better part of a year, did a lot of brainstorming with their leadership as well about how we could find some resources, find some money to make a start, to not, I don't think anybody, believed that we could have enough money where everyone felt fully funded, but we knew that we needed to make a precedence, that we needed to establish a commitment by the federal government to start augmenting or assisting tribes with their capacity issues. Now, I think you've heard there's a $5 million pot of money that's been set aside by the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council. It's monies that they were allocated by the Inflation Reduction Act. And I know it's probably a drip in the bucket, but it's the first drop, and we hope that there are more. And I understand that there are consultation meetings happening this week with the Permitting Council. They want to know from you, how should we spend those monies? And I would really urge you, even if you have to step away from this meeting a little bit, I'm not sure what day it is, but I know you're busy here, but if you can jump onto those calls, I think your participation will be very much appreciated. I just want to acknowledge that that money is set aside for essentially enhancing tribal participation on covered infrastructure projects. So it's not the whole universe of everything that you deal with or consult on. It is sort of a narrower range of projects, really sort of the larger nationwide scale infrastructure projects. And not every tribe will necessarily be engaged in one of those consultations. There's several dozen of those projects around the country, but those that are engaged may find some benefit in establishing a relationship with that permitting council and giving them your thoughts on how they should spend that money. For my part, I will also work with the permitting council to urge them to keep providing additional money into that fund. So, please, if you can, jump in on that. I also wanted to just acknowledge, I know that you've heard already about and have heard from some people here about Appendix C and our efforts there to work with the Army Corps of Engineers to eventually rescind Appendix C and develop guidance with them on how they can carry out their reviews under 36 CFR Part 800. I just want to publicly thank the Army Corps and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary Pinkham for that. I know that was not an easy decision to make. And so I just want to acknowledge that we've played a role. I think hopefully you've seen our letters over the year in making the case that that needed to happen. And we're delighted that the Corps has decided to do that. I also just want to acknowledge, and Ira may or may not cover this a little bit further during his remarks, but I also wanted to acknowledge that we have a long history of working with the National Park Service on revisions to Bulletin 38. I will acknowledge that in 2017, we had worked with the Park Service in tandem with them developing a revision to the bulletin and us developing a Section 106 companion to it. And then 2017 came and a lot of things changed in 2017, and the Park Service chose not to go forward with it. I mention that just simply to say we have been for a very long time a part of the discussion with the National Park Service, informing what they do on the bulletin. It's their bulletin, but informing what they do, but also understanding that there are enormous Section 106 implications for Bulletin 38 as well. And so, we will be talking at the ACHP about how we make sure that our advice on Bulletin 38 and specifically the Section 106 implications is developed and put out there. And of course, that we consult you all on that as well. But I just wanted to acknowledge that we've been part of that discussion, and we're really looking forward to working with the Park Service and I think getting out some of our own information on that as well. So I said I wanted to be brief, and I think if I stop now, I think I can still claim I was brief. It's really nice to see you all. And of course, I will be with all of my colleagues here available for questions at the end of this session. I want to introduce now Ira Matt, the Director of our Office of Native American Affairs, and Jaime Lee Marks, a Senior Program Analyst in our Office of Native American Affairs. All right, take it away.
Well, let me see what time it is. Oh yeah, Hessel Halt. I guess it's afternoon now. Good day, everybody. Excited to be here. We're gonna stay sitting down because that's for important people. But I would like to point out, to our benefit, we brought pictures, so that's gonna make this a lot better.
Yeah, it's hard to compete with.
And for anybody not named Aaron Bryn who can identify some of these photos, we'll hang out later and have a drink. So with that, yeah, you do the clicker. So Office of Native American Affairs, one of the things we did is we kind of gave a lot of this presentation last year. We had come to the NATHPO, kind of refresh. Who is ACHP? Who's the Office of Native American Affairs? What do we do? I'm not going to run through the list. We put some of these back up here so everybody could see the broad range of what it is that we do in our office. And it's everything from training to 101 D5 agreements, to really making sure our agency meets that government to government responsibility and lives up to our trust responsibility. And just so everybody knows, that's the Jocko Trail. I got to spend a lot of wonderful time there years ago when I used to get to go outside. So some of the things we work on in that big umbrella of all of our responsibilities, 106 to government, we have a series of initiatives. And as you can see, these are basically kind of topical areas where we are focusing our efforts. A lot of that happens to now line up with where the White House initiatives are. So it's working out real well. But so many of you folks have been involved with this stuff for years. You guys have been involved in our indigenous knowledge, our traditional knowledge consultations. Our sacred sites work has been ongoing for years, and we're doing a lot of more stuff with it this year. But everything from our international work to climate change, you guys have been a part of. And that's part of how we advance it through the Office of Native American Affairs in particular. You've heard me say it before. We're here to do a lot of the work, but we're here to amplify your voice and to take your message and to action what it is that you guys prioritize so that we have a direction. I'm tribal. I was a TIPO, but now I'm a Fed. And so while I understand everything, I need you guys to communicate that message so I know what to action, because I'm not on the ground anymore. I might see it, but you guys know what you need. Anything else on that? Oh, you ran.
Nothing else, just clicking for now.
And that is a culturally modified tree in Glacier Park. Just in case Glacier's here, sorry. I think you guys took this picture from me. I took it, but 2004, we got to do a wonderful survey out there. It was after following up on the 88 Red Bench fire just to see how many of these modified trees were still around. So that was also a very fun project. And I mentioned the White House Council, they're up next. This is actually a big focus of where the Office of Native American Affairs is now. We have this platform. We have a lot of other agencies that are committed to a lot of the same things that we are. And as Reid noted, we're a small agency. You got 20-some people working on 106. You got a handful of other people making the rest of it go around. For us to be able to advance as many of those initiatives as we do, we have to have partnerships. We got to leverage agencies. We got to work with our tribal and Native Hawaiian partners. And the reality is also that as much as we can advise, or we might be able to dictate in some scenarios, it's the agencies that we want them to just embed a lot of this into their processes and take it forward themselves. So through the White House Council, we've been involved in the treaty rights, the IK group, sacred sites, you got the list there. It keeps us very busy. And some of this stuff we're going to be bringing back to you this year. In particular, the fact that we just recently signed on to the Native Language Memorandum of Agreement. And that was really an easy call for us because the idea that the advisory council wasn't participating didn't sit right with people like Reid Nelson, Jordan Tannenbaum, because the language is so foundational with everything that the tribal preservation community is doing. So we want to participate in that effort and help bring you guys up so you can help advise federal agencies on the best way to incorporate language, why language is affected by their undertakings in their projects, and the fact that all of this is tied together. Next slide. So to build off of last year, we talked like what we were going to do, right? We showed up here and we're like, we got all these plans. Just to prove we weren't just like lying to you guys, we came back to tell you what we did. So with the training development, we actually spent a lot of time working on the, what the heck is that training bill, dude? Working effectively with American Indian and Alaska Native tribal governments. It's something that's been around in various iterations, but they brought it back. We worked closely with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Justice to make sure that training was available across the federal government. We actually talked about the climate action plan last year virtually. We followed it up with listening sessions, and we now have an action plan that we finished last June. We'll be doing an annual report sometime around June to let you know everything we've done to advance what you guys requested. And you heard our chair talk about some of it. It includes helping educate feds, having webinars, but we've also done a lot of other actions, and we'll be sharing that with you so that you realize that when we talk with you, we hear what you say and we do what we can to participate. The Cultural Heritage Working Group, this is something that we haven't talked with you guys as much about, but we are working internationally in a lot of arenas with the State Department to help advise other countries on when they are working with indigenous populations. Because while things here are a challenge and we're constantly fighting to have the voice recognized, there are other places where they are still trying to take that first step. And so we regularly, or we have the opportunity, share what it is to be tribal in the United States, where that's worked for us, but we also communicate the challenges. And I mentioned that native language MOA, but right above that is that tribal consultation PM. That's that presidential memorandum on uniform standards for tribal consultation, and something the advisory council was really excited to participate on at that White House level. That's where we were essentially looking to further inform Executive Order 13175 and to establish more, I would say, clear, and also in some ways thorough requirements for agencies as they reach out and do their consultation processes. Let's face it, there are some agencies that know what they're doing. There are others that aren't. And this was really another step in it, a small step, but to make sure that we help to elevate those expectations. And included in that, in case you guys haven't been aware, there's new minimum timeframes on notices. There's requirements for training at the federal level at the staff, and there's reporting on it. And believe me, the White House, they hit me up just this week. How are we implementing it? Where's our training program? Where are your updated protocols? So they are sticking with these expectations. And alongside that, our outreach and education, that's just part of us being as available as we can to be at webinars, conferences. We do a lot of outreach just with whether it's schools or federal agencies, making sure that we can help communicate the role of Indian tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations in 106. How does consultation work? What are those expectations? We want to go out there and help bridge that gap. I know that conference is coming up soon, so I just borrowed that. But so you guys don't always have to do all that heavy lifting. We're not doing it all, but we're doing what we can to help facilitate where we can. And the tribal treaty rights best practices. We do our best to make sure any treaty rights considerations are addressed before the 106 process. But we're also aware that those same locations, those same resources, those actions, those might also be contributing components of a historic property. A few years back, we developed a guidance paper on this, but we were fortunate to sit not only on the working group, Well, our general counsel, associate general counsel, led the legal subgroup in drafting that best practices in that field guide. And there's not a ton of room to talk about the Section 106 process in there, because treaty rights are a substantive issue that are supposed to be dealt with outside of and before they enter Section 106. But we made sure, like we have with any of these other agreements that we were in, the treaty rights MOU, we made sure that cultural resources were included. You guys know how it works. Environmental resources are always included. There wasn't a statement that said environmental that didn't also say cultural after we had an opportunity to help influence it. It's a small step, but we got to make sure one of the first steps is that they recognize the responsibility to consider cultural resources. Just like last week, for anybody who got to listen to Chair Bronin, Shasta, and Mike talk about the connection between climate change and historic properties and sacred sites. Got anything? Oh, man. And by the way, that's a picture of the Flathead River. That's at my ranch. That was changing the pump, which I hide behind those bushes. So please don't steal it.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to add that I know many of y'all from my time at the TIPA program at the Park Service, and we have some ongoing friendships here. And it's been really great to be able to work at the ACHP because we really do have that opportunity to take comments that you've shared with me and us both over the years, but also in these listening sessions and consultation, and make really direct comments to federal agency documents that we do see implemented over time. So it has been really great to kind of see more of the behind the scenes of how seriously some of that advice is taken.
And I think to close it out, we're talking about what we're going to do this year. And I think you heard the chair and Reid talk about some of this. You heard Bulletin 38 earlier. But a big thing for us is we have our information paper. At the time it was called Traditional Knowledge. We worked with the White House on that broad Indigenous knowledge guidance document. But for anybody who's read it, you know it needs to be tailored to the 106 process, to historic preservation broadly. And that's why we want to have our own policy statement that really speaks about it. What Chair Bronin mentioned earlier about the burial sites, human remains, and funerary objects. A lot of that's common sense. But unfortunately, we do have to write it down for feds. And it's also so that there's a common understanding. When we come out to you, and actually we just got done crafting a lot of information, we'll be sharing it with you, asking as a first step to do listening sessions on how we should draft this policy statement, utilizing your input. This is going to seem like a lot of common sense statements for us, but it's going to be important to make sure that when we set this policy statement at that leadership level, that is the advisory council, that trickles down into everything we do at the staff level, guidance, training, information, how we advise in Section 106 consultation. So we're excited to be able to have your input on that. The burial sites policy statement, you guys have all participated in that for a better part of a year almost. We're hoping we're getting near a conclusion so we can actually advance that. There were some great statements earlier in the sense that there needs to be more focus on this. While a Section 106 is a narrow lane when we're talking about these important areas, it's something that we made sure we prioritized. Because I don't think there's anybody out here working for a tribe with a tribe that hasn't had those challenges and those hurdles of working with either ancestors or even deceased loved ones that you knew personally, and have had other people try to bring something like the regulations or a state policy or a state law forward and talk about it. When on the other hand, as the gentleman was noting, a burial area, or excuse me, a cemetery has all kinds of legal protections. Why isn't that the case for Indian people? So for our opportunity and our range here at the ACHP, we're advancing that. We mentioned sacred sites in 106. Bill Dancing Feathers pulling something together. We're taking the next step in our guidance on that. We had something that we placed out almost a decade ago now. It didn't say a whole lot. It made some great statements, but we want to take that next step to help people understand that those are separate and distinct requirements between the executive order and the regulations. There might be overlap, and there might be opportunities where you can address sacred sites in the 106 process, but that you cannot pigeonhole sacred sites into 106 and expect that to be the outlet. So we're going to help inform agencies, but we're going to have listening sessions with tribes to help understand, what do we need to communicate? What are those messages that we need to bring forward so that we can have more information to provide to agencies so that they're able to follow up on their responsibility to have procedures to address sacred sites, so that they're aware that unlike section 106, where a historic property is really this group decision, the executive order is clear. Indian tribes define what is a sacred site. It's the responsibility of the agency to ensure access and protection. As I noted with that presidential memorandum, we're going to be updating our consultation protocols. We have done that very recently, but we made sure and supported the administration in the development of that memorandum. And there's some things that we can update in our protocols. That's not going to be a big lift. And to be honest, a lot of what we're going to do is develop a lot more of our internal processes so that we're able to make sure that we have consistency as we reach out to you all. I think historically, and Reid, correct me if I'm wrong, there wasn't a lot of consultations the ACHP was doing. It felt like 1 or 2 a year. We're ramping up to the point where we're doing 6, 7, 8. We have 2 or 3 running at a time, not a lot. But it also means that we need to be better about having our consistency when we report each year. I mentioned the treaty rights best practices. We're going to be updating our document to make sure we're consistent with what the White House is saying, providing further clarity to agencies on how that works. Jaime Loichinger and I recently dealt with it again, where we were advising on how SHPOs, agencies really need to be working around that dynamic that is treaty rights. And so it's something that instead of us addressing it on a case by case, we'll make sure that's updated so that everybody has as much relevant and current information as possible to hopefully make your guys' jobs and lives easier in that. And we talked about the climate change webinar. I just like to put it in here because Shasta and Mike did such a wonderful job. I don't know where Shasta is, but is she right down here? I see people pointing. Oh, there you go. If you haven't watched it yet, it'll be on the White House Council's website, I think in about 3 weeks. It's definitely worth watching. You had 3 leaders in the industry between the chair, Mike, and Shasta. And it's our first step to make sure that as agencies are developing these plans as a result of an executive order with numbers I can't remember that requires them to have these plans, they will be updating them. And we wanted to get in early and make sure they understood that in those plans, they need to consider and mention cultural resources and sacred sites, because from those broad departmental and agency plans come more specific actions and emergency responses that are going to look at that plan. So we made sure when we looked at the White House and we knew these actions were coming, Jamie Lee and I fought hard to have that February time slot and to have voices like Shasta who had experience so that we were able to make sure agencies understood that expectation. Because as you guys know, it's hard enough working in our cultural resource arena and having people understand those expectations. We step out into that environmental world, into the climate world, and you've got a whole lot of other people who do not understand that connection between climate and the resources, the environment and cultural practices. And between the 3 speakers, they did an amazing job. I think that's it. And so I'll turn it over to Jamie Lee for some closing words from ONA.
Just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's participated in recent listening sessions and have supported the development of the burial policy. And we really look forward to your collaboration on building an Indigenous knowledge policy. Y'all's insight is going to be really important to taking that home. Please reach out to us at any time. I feel like that's really small, but maybe over there it's bigger, but our email addresses are here. Please just come up and say hi to one of us and we can exchange contact information.
I did that because the picture's better than art.
The picture is better than our names, confirmed. Yes.
Oh, sorry, I screwed up too. And with that, I'm going to introduce Jaime Loichinger, our Assistant Director, to go from here.
For part 2, I guess, I've heard my voice too much already, although Ira still beats us. you've heard him for hours, but 2022 is looks a lot like what 2023 is shaping up to be in the Office of Federal Agency Programs. Ira had asked me to kind of give an overview of 2022 achievements. I can't remember them. It was just a nonstop kind of, cases coming in. Seemed like every time we got a new agreement executed, we were moving right on to the next case. There was already one teed up there, ready to go. Some of the notable things though would be that we did put together a lot of training and a lot of guidance. We revamped a lot of it. We updated our website with it. One of the big things that has stayed constant has been the development of program alternatives that we unfortunately just don't see that changing for the short term. So we have been working to update the guidance on our website. Notably, last year, we did do one on program comments, and it lays out what their purpose is, but also how they're to be developed. There were a lot of questions from agencies, and you all probably saw a lot of variation in how and when and how long it took. So we've put together guidance on program comments to assist everybody in that process. We're doing the same right now for nationwide PAs so that people can understand how those are developed and what those timelines look like. I had mentioned this morning, I oversee the federal permitting, licensing, and assistance section. We also have the counterpart, the federal property management section. That's where a lot of those program alternatives are coming out of these days. Some of you may have already been in consultation regarding the program comment for Vietnam era housing. Yes, that one's coming in for a vote in mid-March. So, feel free to reach out to that section if you have any questions about remaining consultation efforts or any other comments that you would like to make on it. The other part of it, of course, continues to be our very active training program. We've revamped all of our webinars. Some of you hopefully have been able to join us for our spring webinar series. We are rolling out a new one actually next week on CERCLA and Section 106. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that if that's one that you've worked with before too. Training is still primarily in the virtual format. We are going to test out some of the in-person training at a couple of sites this year, but it's great to be able to reach so many more people virtually too and have that as an option. I'm not even going to run through the list of program alternatives. There's just a number of them, and they're all in various stages of very early development. So if you have any questions about something specifically involving an agency or operations and maintenance at any of their facilities, I'm happy to answer those questions where I can, and then get you in touch with the correct staff. That's probably the other point. Reid touched on the fact that we are getting ready to hire a digital operations coordinator. An offer actually happened just yesterday. And also posted today is an announcement for an assistant preservation specialist in the Office of Federal Agency Programs in the permitting section. So if you know anybody who wants to come and tackle big things like Appendix C at the ACHP, we'd love to have you take a look at that announcement. I'm happy to answer any questions about that too. So I'll go ahead and leave it there because I'd rather talk with you all about what else you're hearing and what questions you might have. And let's Reid as director of OFAP if you had anything you wanted to offer.
Thank you, Jamie.
Shasta's coming to help. Yeah, Valerie.
All right, this is questions, but you know what? I'm actually going to ask a question. I've been holding my tongue these last couple of days so that other people can speak. But so some of you learned last night that you already knew, I think, that NATHPO has a voting seat on the advisory council, and that seat is held automatically by the chair of the board of NATHPO. So that's me. And if I'm not there, then it's Valerie. So I am very well acquainted with what these fine folks do and what these fine folks sometimes screw up. Just, we got to be honest with each other, right? But I do want to just point out that with only 22 people on your staff, it's a lot of work and there's a lot that remains to be done. And the point I want to make, I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but it might become a question. There's a lot of new guidance out there, and there are a lot of changes being made, like we heard in the last session about Section 106. And the core or Appendix C, and the guidance, we seem to hear a lot from the people at the top about what that guidance is going to be or what those changes are going to be, but we don't hear a lot about how that's going to get pushed down to the level of practitioners, the people who are actually doing the consultations and sending us the letters and making the phone calls. And I don't know, show of hands, how many of you think your local Army Corps staff actually know what they're supposed to be doing under Section 106? Yeah, no hands, right? I was just sitting there at my desk, at my table. And I thought I need to find something as an analogy for the level of training that is or is not required for the people who do Section 106. And even though I just got Reid's email saying we have a new Section 106 training coming up, sign up. I thought I'm gonna look for something else. How many hours does it take for somebody to get their cosmetology license? How many hours do you have to have before you can take the test? Anybody know? Close. Maybe it's different from state to state.
I was just going to say the answer is it varies from state to state. I looked into it. This job is very stressful.
I think I looked for California and it was 1,500. 1,500 hours, you guys, to cut somebody's hair. How many hours of training are required for a Section 106 practitioner to do consultation with a tribe? Goose egg. So then I guess my question and my challenge to you, my colleagues on the ACHP, is what are we going to do together to get the word out to the people on the ground who are still telling us as tribal representatives, actually, no, we don't have to do that because it says this, this, and that. I'm like, well, actually, no, Appendix C was rescinded and it was illegal in the first place. So suck it. But they're not hearing it.
Yeah.
They're not hearing it. We need them to hear it. And we also need them to hear that just because a tribe has provided them with information about what we're concerned about, that they don't just get to put that into their report and broadcast it to the world. I haven't heard anything yet since we've been here about confidentiality and protecting tribal data. So under that tribal ecological knowledge piece that came from the White House, which is good, but not great, it needs work. The burial policy, all of these things, they need to say something about confidentiality, and they need to say something about how we are going to get that word out, that tribes can have the right to say, we don't want you to do anything here, and we don't have to tell you why, because it's confidential. So that's my challenge to you. It's not a question, it's a challenge. And you guys are going to see me in a couple of weeks and I will challenge you again because that's what I do. And Ira, please stop saying my name. When it comes to like the webinars and stuff like that, I want you to set the bar low. Say Shasta was on this webinar and it was really terrible. And that way, people's expectations will be lower.
Woman's gone.
Dr. Gone.
Dr. Gone.
Yeah.
Doctor, we do have sensitive information and confidentiality in the burial policy. So you just gotta, it's all Appendix C down here. We're safe. No.
You're right. It is in there, but that's been bubbling up in me since we started. And so I finally got it out. Reid, did you want to respond?
Yeah, Shasta, you said it well. I mean, that's the perennial challenge. You're absolutely right, is to get the word out. And we work through every channel we have. And yet every time I know we send an email or a communication to everyone we've ever met in the preservation community, that it doesn't get to the right folks. And so I would just say, if you've got ideas on how we can improve that, let us know. One of the things I will tell you, as Ira can attest and Jaime can attest, I will not allow staff to develop a plan for revising or developing guidance without an implementation plan, that includes how to work with federal agencies, states, tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, preservation organizations, and others to get the word out. The worst kind of policy is the one that's written and hung on a website and forgotten. So I completely agree with you. I would just challenge you, and I mean this seriously, that I know you're reaching more people than we are directly with our own advice. We work to get it out, but you work every day with your local offices. I would just simply say, look at the guidance that we have, share it with those federal agencies and say, if you don't believe us, call Jaime, call Ira, call Reid. We're available. We'll do whatever we can to back you up.
Thank you.
I'll just add on the confidentiality point. I think that's also in the draft climate change that a draft that you just got. And I know that because I put it in the draft. So just hopefully that stays in. I can't imagine why it wouldn't be, but it's a reference that's in there. I think one of the reasons why, just to amplify what my colleagues have already said, that people may not get the word is that people don't know this agency exists and don't know Section 106 rules are out there. Part of my job as chair is to make sure people know this agency exists, they understand what it does, and that the Section 106 big chunk of what the advisory council does is well known and well understood. I come from a policy background. I'm super interested in the stuff I talked about and a lot of the stuff that Ira and Jamie Lee were discussing and those policy issues. But I recognize that the agency, its bread and butter activities, the bulk of the staff is working on the Section 106 review process. So if there are opportunities that you see for me to get in front of people and for me to get, as chair, I'm a free agent. I keep saying I don't have the same constraints as staff. These things, I don't have a portfolio. So give me a portfolio, invite me to talk with people, explain, shoot a message over to our team or to me saying, we're running up against this obstacle. As a chair of an agency, the head of an agency, I have the same, albeit a tiny agency, the same, supposed to be able to talk with other heads of agencies, and I intend to do that. So again, I'm yet another conduit for that, and I hope to use my position to do that. Thanks.
All right, questions? Oh, Mr. Rattling Leaf.
Good afternoon. My name is James Rowlingleaf. I'm principal of Wolacota Lab consulting group that works in traditional knowledge, climate change, and data sovereignty. My question to you is, I really appreciate the update, and I'm here really to learn and how we work together to support the protection and sustainability of cultural resources in a changing climate. And my question is, I'm aware of the ITEC guidance works to the White House. I was part of a webinar that talked about that in terms of collecting comments. And I brought the question to the team, the role of UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. I said, those are principles that are supported by Indigenous people around the world. And I noticed that there was an international topic here or area that you're working in. So I brought that to the White House people and said, will that be included, or that kind of language, or those principles and protocols be included in the ITEC guidance document? And they said no. So I guess some clarity on that from you guys. I mean, to me, maybe that's the future of where this work is going in terms of free and prior informed consent and those kind of things. But I understand that the U.S. government does not support UNDRIP or the adoption of UNDRIP. That's my first question. So what's the future of UNDRIP in terms of this work? The second question again is data sovereignty. The idea of confidentiality came up. Increasingly, more and more data is coming about tribal nations. And so those of us that work in the climate science arena work with data all the time. And we talk about working with tribes and supporting their uses of climate data. So what's your thoughts? What's your perspectives on the idea of data sovereignty? And can you give us an update on, at least from the government side, where that might be going? So thank you.
I know everybody was fighting me to answer that one over here, but so UNDRIP, I think it's a great one. And Mr. Rattling Leaf, I know we were on a webinar at some point. I think Cal, Tipo, Shippo, maybe. It's tough to say anymore. They all start to blend together. But the advisory council, one good thing about us is that we are pretty small, and that means we can be nimble. So I think we're the only agency that actually has an action plan to implement the United Nations Declaration. And that's one of the things that we've been working on. And the burial policy, the repatriation principle, is actually taken from the United Nations Declaration, and the information we have on it to support it in our companion document is essentially that the ACHP, through our leadership, fully support tribes being able to utilize the United Nations Declaration as they seek the repatriation and the return of ancestors. So for our opportunities, we're starting to move some of the United Nations Declaration. And I can say in the bigger picture for that ITEC document, I was on the working group there. The United Nations Declaration data sovereignty, those basically became such large discussions, especially when we looked at this in an all of government perspective. Even indigenous knowledge coming to, when you bring in the health fields and you bring in natural resource management and you had all of the other fields dealing with health and welfare, it became large. And so there was an entire discussion, again, led by our Associate General Counsel about that, but they weren't able to basically package it in a comprehensive enough manner. So that group has been reformed. The Indigenous Knowledge Group is actually now under the NTSC, and I could not tell you what that stands for. But they have another subcommittee, and they're looking at topics that they weren't able to address in that main guidance to come back and speak at again. And the big challenge that comes to a head is, from a tribal perspective, we're not fans of FOIA, right? FOIA has been a challenge, a problem. But what was FOIA when it was brought out? It was championed as something for the American public. So it was meant to be good, to provide access to all that information. Well, unwittingly, it impacted tribes. So as agencies, when we look to say there's issues with this, it really kind of causes that conflict in the administration to say this was championed as something good, and now we're hearing problems. So we've been looking at ways to try to advance awareness. And a lot of it comes from the facts, and I'll defer to you on this, Mr. Rattlingly, but the whole concept of data sovereignty, data confidentiality, sensitive information in a technical aspect is beyond most of the archaeologists and a lot of the field staff you deal with. It's very technical. And when you're around the people who start speaking in that arena, it's very complex. And so to expect archaeologists and field staff to be able to digest it and apply it in their decision-making is something we've found that they absolutely need greater awareness of, because it is complex. A lot of them don't even realize how they're supposed to go through a government to government structure to even acquire information from a tribe. So it's truly been, I guess, not accommodated, not addressed, what seems like for decades now, so that there is a lot of effort that's going to be needed to even catch people up. So there are efforts in that arena, and you know all the same people, Gretchen Goldman, the people you are on that with, and we can have them speak more about the efforts that are coming out of the White House on it. That's not necessarily for us. We're on the working group. But I can tell you, when we get together, it's been a difficult discussion to say, how do we go beyond 304 without there being some sort of amendment to that Freedom of Information Act, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but ACHP can't do that. Maybe the chair has opportunities to do something like that, but it's beyond our staff level to move in those directions. There have been efforts, the Respect Act that was moving through Representative Grijalva. And so we've seen some of this, and we have, done what we can to help inform it, to make sure, again, sacred sites, historic properties, cultural resources are considered, but there's a lot moving. And just to, and I'll pitch it back over to you guys in a second. Take a look at ACHP's action plan. We have identified where there are articles in the declaration, how they align with the regulations and how agencies can advance that. And we are ready to take that next step in that. And it's just figuring out within those initiatives that we have for 2023, if we prioritize it over something, or we begin to build a partnership with some other folks that know it better than I do to figure out what those next steps are. I'll pass it down the line here.
I'll just add on that last point that you mentioned about, where, to the extent that we have been able to issue guidance on tribal confidentiality, I think we have done some of that so far. The way that our legislative process works, or the types of things that ACHP as an independent agency develops its legislative priorities is through the committee framework. So we have a committee that reviews those. That committee is meeting next week. We will vote on legislative priorities at our official meeting in 2 weeks. So, we can check out what's on that list so far and see if it encompasses something like a discussion about FOI issues, because we've already said what we think. And it doesn't seem to be a big leap to say, well, other people should think it too. And in fact, I think that's where the advisory council has new opportunities with a full-time chair. I'm only the second. The first one came in 2018, 2020. So just a couple of years ago. And again, I'm only the second. So I think our ability to get out there and say, hey, we've done this, so why don't other people do too, I think is yet to be determined. It's something that we just haven't done a lot of yet. And again, the Section 106 review process, all of that has been, running along and staff has been working on that. But an opportunity for the agency is being able to influence Congress, the White House, other agency partners in deeper and more meaningful ways. So I put that on my list.
We have another question over here or comment?
Hi, I'm Ellen Chapman from Cultural Heritage Partners, and we represent the Nansemond Indian Nation. And I wanted to talk about offshore wind. Obviously, there's a lot of wind projects that are on the permitting dashboard currently, and they're sort of bearing down really quickly for a lot of tribal communities. And one of the sort of challenges that I see, and I'm wondering about your thoughts on, is the sort of pressures of permitting speed versus the needs of tribal consultation. There's one specific instance the Nansemond have had recently where they were asked to comment on phase 2 work plans for Kitty Hawk and had not been provided with the phase 1 archaeological report that, obviously is the basis for these phase 2 work plans. And in addition, multiple sites that were in those work plans had already actually been excavated multiple years ago. So there's a sort of issue where some of the ways in which tribes are being asked to consult is not meaningful and is not substantive and is more of a kind of a box checking. So I was just wondering how ACHP sees, the needs of offshore wind and the permitting requirements versus the need to actually get meaningful input from tribes and not sort of waste their time on something that has already kind of gone under the bridge. Thank you.
Do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I would hope we all see the need the same way that you do. And that is that agencies that are advancing the administration's offshore wind agenda, which is a very important element for this administration, that they work as effectively and early and regularly in consulting tribes as possible. I will tell you that we have one staff person that does very little else other than work with agencies that are advancing offshore wind. Chris Daniel is his name. Some of you probably know him. There are others involved as well. And so we certainly recognize that offshore wind consultations are important. We also recognize that because of frankly, just the sheer number of them, that they present a challenge for tribes in having the capacity to effectively engage in those consultations, to make sense of the reports, to have the time to review them and meaningfully provide views and feedback. I would just say two things. One is I know that we're working with BOEM regularly on sort of talking on the global scale of offshore wind about ways they can make improvements. And I see someone from BOEM here, Sarah Stokely, who we work with regularly, a former ACHP staff, by the way. And so I know BOEM is taking very seriously our advice and I think in every regard doing their level best. But I would just go back to something I spoke about earlier. I think we all recognize that even when things are going as well as possible, that there are some tribes in particular, and I would just note offshore wind is really advancing on the Northeast coast. There are some tribes that are really quite challenged to keep up with the level of consultation. And that's exactly the challenge that was on the mind of the Permitting Council when it established that $5 million pot of money. Now, again, as we mentioned earlier, it's not enough, and we'll see how it helps and in what ways it might be made available to tribes. But I think there's a recognition in this government that there are some infrastructure sectors that are imposing unique and probably extraordinary burdens on tribes, and we're sensitive to that. So I would say, please, by all means, let us know what those burdens are, and we'll continue to work with the permitting council and to work directly with the agency and you all to address them. The other thing that I want to mention real quickly, and I meant to talk about it this morning, is that I also think there are opportunities, and especially now, given that many agencies received really substantial pots of money under the Inflation Reduction Act, and some under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act earlier. There are really some opportunities for agencies themselves to step forward and provide some capacity assistance as well. And I would just acknowledge that not long before Chair Bronin came on board, our former acting chair sent a letter to the heads of about a dozen agencies who had received money under the Inflation Reduction Act and said, here's a list of things that you should very seriously consider spending that money on. And the primary, I think one of the very first issues, sort of in addition to them hiring their own staff, was our advice that they look to provide assistance to states and tribes who are inundated by these consultations. And I would just remind you as well that I know one of the things you hear from agencies is we can't do that. And the ACHP begs to differ. I'm not saying any agency in this room has said that, but what I do know from experience is that when you're working with people in the field, you often hear, we can't do that. And about 8 years ago, our council spent about 2 years developing a set of guidance that I hope you are familiar with, that is about providing assistance in the Section 106 review process. And it's on our website. And one of the things that guidance says is that there are mechanisms available for agencies to provide that direct assistance. And I also recognize, I'll just say that I know sometimes, rather than the agency providing the assistance, the applicant might. We understand that. That works too. We're here to find any solution we can.
Okay, we have one more question over here before we. need
And
to
as
move
Shasta's
on.
walking, I'll simply acknowledge, Ellen, I think you just hit, I've worked with permitting and licensing and assistance agencies for 18 years now. It's always that push pull. It's easier when you own the property and you're the federal agency proposing the action. And I think what Reid was hitting on there about that early active involvement, not just by the agency, but by a proponent, and that early coordination really is critical. And to the extent that we keep hounding and pounding on that message, we will. So.
Quick question, Natasawis, Winata, and then Nutumas, Mississippi Wampanoag. Hello, everyone. My name is David Reid, and I'm a TIPO for the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and also a tribal councilman. A couple of questions and then a couple of statements. One question is, are sacred sites afforded protections in maritime environments the same as they are in terrestrial situations? My concern is for offshore projects out on and within the outer continental shelf.
Well, listen, I'll answer that question by saying they should be. Whether they are or not, I mean, is really a sort of a matter of what your experience is. But I see, while I understand, and certainly we, I think as many of you know, our understanding of these sorts of properties dramatically improved after our involvement in the Cape Wind project, as it was called in 2010. But, we understand that there are properties offshore that are just as important, maybe different in some ways than the properties onshore. But in my mind, just as important and just as significant and as identifiable and, as good a candidates to consider in the Section 106 review process as any. So, that's my response is they should be treated equally. Now, whether they are or not, we would love to hear from you if you perceive there to be deficiencies in the way agencies are or are not identifying them, considering them, consulting on them. We'd love to know more. And maybe Ira, I don't know if you want to add to
Well, one issue that we have with them is that these wind farm activities, they're so rushed right now. The administration has relied heavily on these things coming to fruition with the promises of jobs and clean energy coming. They're very aggressively being developed. Now, there's a lot of due diligence that should have been done a long time ago. Technology is not there to do archaeology the way that we do on land. And even that on land is a representative sampling. It's not a definitive science to say that the area is cleared and there's no archaeological sites on that site. It's a representative sampling. Now in a maritime environment, technology, you can't even do archaeology essentially. So there should have been mapping done within our respective region. It's shallow submerged lands. There's ancient submerged paleo landscapes. There's ancient lake beds. There's the ancient river that fed the ancient lake in the middle of Nantucket Sound. You can see it from Google Earth. It's still there. There's still remnants of those submerged environments with the coastal, with coastal transgression and sea level rise. We inhabited those. We've been there for the past 15,000 years. If you listen to science and evidence from science, our creation stories start from the beginning. We've always been there. And, you could walk out to Georges Bank, out to the edge of the exclusive economic zone. And so with that, as being the only ones that have inhabited that space and shared that environment for the past 15, 20,000 years, those sites are sacred to us, any of those areas within those submerged landscapes. Now, with that, we're not even asked or we're not even invited or required to be signatories on MOUs. States are able to sign off on them. ACHP signed off on them. I think BOEM signs off on them. Now, tribes, you're invited as a signatory, but it doesn't have to rise to the level of your agreement. The things that are being discussed in there, the cultural provenance is ours. Nobody else should be able to sign off on these things aside from the tribes. And the state, SHPO, their jurisdiction ends at state waters. These projects begin in federal waters. So in my opinion, it seems like it's a violation of administrative procedures to allow a SHPO to sign off on the document and not afford tribes opportunity to sign off and have it rise to our level of agreement. And, that's a problem that we have with the way things are happening right now. That's one of the problems. For us, we have quite a few problems. The other thing is Section 106. I heard Section 106 mentioned. At the end of the day, one of the main problems is that for Eastern tribes, Section 106 is primarily off reservation. There's no funding mechanism. It's an unfunded mandate. And what little money, if you have an approved program, then you get, the money from the Historic Preservation Fund, but that's for on-reservation, maintaining on-reservation inventories. Section 106 is advisory council should state and come out very firmly, reaffirm that it's an unfunded mandate, and every agency or project proponent should contribute based on the work commensurate of the work relative to the 106 engagement for every agency and every project. Incrementally, it should be small, in my opinion. And if it were, then the program would be sustainable. Right now, it's completely at the financial burden of the tribes to participate in Section 106. And that's not right, because we wouldn't be out there reviewing things, making determinations and findings if the projects weren't going on. And so, it's requiring us and mandated that you consult government to government and all that. But at the end of the day, it's an unfunded mandate. So, that's some of the things. We also have issues with the North Atlantic right whales and our relationships to those whales. They're our relatives. And we don't feel as though the scoping process is adequately protecting our relatives, the North Atlantic right whale. So these are some of the concerns that I have, and there should be a shared jurisdictional approach, because at the end of the day, not every tribe is a treaty tribe. Here in the East, Our people, we didn't have treaties. We predate the federal government. Our relationship began with colonization when the Mayflower got here. And so with that, we recently got federally recognized. The process in which we got federal recognized, we retain all rights, title, interest, and jurisdictional authority as inherent rights as the original peoples. And so Mashpee's asserting, and I think some of the other tribes are asserting that we argue that we have a shared jurisdictional interest in the submerged lands out to the exclusive economic zone, because we were the ones that inhabited those spaces and have been here for the past 20,000 years, minimally. Thank you.
Do you want to be the next NATHPO chair? So
We
we
can't
already.
make it that
all
easy,
agreed,
Shasta.
But if you have a final comment you want to make on any of that, then feel free.
I will just say briefly, thank you. I mean, I think you remind me of the important things that are already in ACHP documents, whether it's the documents we sent to the Secretary of Interior conveying our comments on Cape Wind that laid out a whole set of recommendations on addressing offshore wind development and the very sorts of issues that you talked about, or whether it's looking at the policy that I mentioned on compensating consulting parties in the Section 106 review process. I'm reminded and I'm inspired by Chair Bronin, who has said, we're not going to let policies sit. We're going to use them to affect change. That this gives us an opportunity to go back to those policies. They give us the platform to make the case that you've made. And I think your question reminds me of the importance of us doing that.
And I'll just close by saying there's so much work to do. So listen here today, listen to everything and getting connected with what the Office of Native American Affairs does. There's so much work that we can do. And as just one vote on the council, again, part of my job is to convince those other council members to come along with the kinds of things that I think we in this room probably need to start making, to agree, needs to start incrementally or not incrementally moving forward. So please, again, be in touch, continue to help us, advise us. You're the experts. We're not the experts. At least I'm not the expert. I'm by no means the expert. So please continue to advise me and other non-experts that may be sitting up here today. Thank you so much for letting us talk.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate you all making the trip down here. Especially Chair Bronin. It's so nice to hear from you and to see you listening. And Reid, I think you earned yourself a spot on we want to pre-approve your messaging next time. Please don't encourage conference attendees to leave the conference. Please stay in the conference. Thank you. If our next panel could start making their way to the stage.
Oh, yeah.